If you walk down Pudding Lane in modern London today, you will see giant glass skyscrapers, busy people drinking coffee, and a crowd of 9 million residents. It is a clean, strong city. But if you rewind exactly to midnight on September 2nd, 1666, you would find a completely different world. You would be trapped in a dark maze of wooden houses filled with 350,000 people. They had no idea that a tiny forgotten chore would soon cause an explosion of destruction. In less than 4 hours, a small mistake would start an unstoppable monster that brought an entire empire to its knees. For hundreds of years, we have only been able to imagine this terrible disaster through boring textbook stories and old diary entries. It is hard to picture how fast a city can burn just from reading words on a page. But now, we can look at this event through a much clearer lens. By using advanced computer tools trained on original maps from the 17th century, we can bring faded old drawings and paintings to life. They turn into highly realistic, three-dimensional views right before your eyes. You can finally see the cobblestones, the crowds, and the thick smoke rising over the river exactly as it looked back then. Across this vintage map of the River Thames, a burning timeline will show you the crisis hour by hour, tracking the damage from day 1 to day 4. This is the true story of how one simple oversight in a small bakery created a giant inferno that changed history forever. Let's look at the data and see where the spark began. To understand why this disaster happened, we have to look closely at how the city was set up. Think of old London as a crowded petri dish that was perfectly built for a massive bacterial outbreak, only in this case, the bacteria was fire. In 1666, London was the most powerful trading hub in the world, but its physical design was a complete mess. The community was still packed inside the original stone walls built by the Romans 16 centuries earlier. Because space within this old boundary was so limited, the population exploded. More than 300,000 people were squeezed into tiny, chaotic quarters like loose papers shoved into a small drawer. The architecture back then used a dangerous building style called jettying. This meant that the wooden upper floors of a house stuck out further than the bottom floor to create more living space. On Pudding Lane, the narrow alleyway located exactly where the giant stone monument stands today, these overhanging roofs were so close that you could easily reach out of your window and shake hands with your neighbor across the street. This design blocked out the sun and trapped air below. It created a dark, tight canyon where old oak wood and flammable tar pitch dried out in the summer heat. The data shows us a very clear, hard truth. The city was not designed to protect human lives. It was designed to maximize real estate profits, and that created a giant tinderbox. At the same time, the population itself was shifting. London was a chaotic mix of wealthy merchant guilds and incredibly poor laborers who lived side by side. This extreme crowding meant that everyday habits became high-risk behaviors. People stored massive piles of coal, wood, and hay right inside their homes to prepare for the coming winter. Imagine living inside a house made of dry kindling, and then filling the rooms with charcoal and oil. It only takes one small mistake to turn a crowded neighborhood into a giant campfire. As a mentor looking back at these numbers, the lesson is clear. When we ignore safety to save space and money, a crisis is not just a possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. The stage was perfectly set, and all the city needed was a single spark to start the clock. The clock reads 11 o'clock on Saturday night, and the king's personal baker, a man named Thomas Fariner, has just finished making a large batch of biscuits for the Royal Navy. He does his normal nighttime routine. He sweeps the floor, checks the hearth, and dampens the oven's fire. He truly believes the hot coals are safely buried under the ash, so he takes his family upstairs to bed. But Fariner made one critical error that completely overrode his safety routine. He left a small pile of dry kindling wood stacked right next to the hot oven door. In any safety system, leaving fuel right next to a heat source is a recipe for disaster. By 1 o'clock in the morning, a tiny stray coal slips past the iron grate of the oven. It drops silently onto the kindling. Within 20 minutes, the basement is totally filled with white-hot flames. The fire spread so fast that it completely blocks the stairs, trapping the family on the upper floors. They are forced to crawl out of a small attic window and scramble across the roofs to save their lives. I want you to look at this event like a chain reaction in a laboratory. The failure did not happen because the baker was a bad person. It happened because his daily habits lacked a foolproof buffer. When the bakery collapsed into a roaring pile of ash, it released a massive amount of heat energy directly into the narrow street. Because the houses were built so close together, the fire easily jumped from the bakery to the neighboring wooden buildings. The city's initial defense system completely failed to resist the pressure of the flame. Instead of holding the line, the tightly packed timber neighborhood acted like a row of falling dominoes, feeding the monster and setting off a massive disaster that could no longer be stopped by simple tools. By 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, a small group of town watchmen arrived at the burning bakery. They quickly noticed that the flames were moving toward the nearby riverfront warehouses. These warehouses were packed tightly with highly flammable items like oil, brandy, and tar. The watchmen knew they were facing a massive emergency, so they immediately called for the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. Under the city's safety laws, the best way to stop a fire in a wooden town was to create a firebreak. This meant using large iron hooks and ropes to pull down the healthy wooden houses surrounding the fire, leaving an empty space so the flames would run out of fuel. However, the leader failed to act because he was looking at the wrong set of metrics. Instead of focusing on saving lives and protecting the community, Bloodworth was worried about the short-term financial cost of destroying those properties. He did not want to pay the homeowners for their lost buildings. He looked at the growing fire, waved his hand dismissively, and said a line that history would never forget: "Pish! A woman might piss it out." Then, he went back to bed. By choosing comfort over immediate action, he broke the most important rule of crisis management. He ignored the clear data of a growing threat, and that single mistake completely ruined the city's chances of stopping the disaster early. By sunrise on Sunday, the disaster entered a dangerous new phase. When a crisis is left to grow without early resistance, the environment itself changes and starts working against you. The weather data shows us that an unusually harsh, dry wind began blowing from the southeast. Think of this wind like a giant bellows pumping oxygen directly into a campfire. It carried burning sparks from house to house across those narrow, overhanging roofs. Even worse, the wind pushed the fire straight toward the northern banks of the River Thames. This area was the city's commercial core, filled with warehouses packed with coal, timber, and oil. When the fire hit these storage areas, it was like throwing gasoline onto hot coals. The fire was now so large that it created its own microclimate. The extreme heat created a powerful thermal updraft, drawing in more air from the surrounding areas and turning the tight alleyways into active blast furnaces. At this point, the structural division of London became a massive obstacle to teamwork. Historically, London was split into two completely different sections: Westminster, which held the royal political power, and the City of London, which controlled the financial commerce. Because of this split, the local city leaders tried to handle the emergency alone, refusing to ask the royal government for help until it was far too late. When a problem gets too big for your local team, you must break down political walls and look at the macro data. Realizing that the Lord Mayor had completely lost control of the situation, King Charles II had to step in and make a major tactical pivot. He overrode the local authorities and stripped the city leadership of their power. He handed absolute military command to his brother, the Duke of York, and the royal soldiers. The king brought in heavy military equipment and thousands of disciplined troops to take over the streets. This teaches us an important lesson about crisis management. When a disaster outgrows your current system, you must immediately change your strategy, bring in stronger resources, and add just your structure before the entire operation is completely wiped out. By Monday morning, the true cost of systemic neglect became impossible to hide. When a crisis breaks past your initial defenses, it does not just destroy physical structures, it completely paralyzes the networks that keep society running. Think of the city's ancient trade guilds like the major software programs running a modern economy. These powerful commercial groups controlled all the wealth and manufacturing in London, but as the fire traveled over half a mile in just a few hours, their entire system crashed. The physical infrastructure failed completely. The massive wooden water wheels built under London Bridge, which used river power to pump water through primitive wooden pipes, burned to ash. This completely cut off water pressure to the public plugs, leaving the community with empty buckets against a towering wall of flame. With the physical and economic systems down, the social fabric of the city began to snap. Human data shows us that when people are terrified and lack accurate information, panic fills the void. Rumors spread through the running crowds like wildfire. People began to believe that the disaster was not a terrible accident, but a coordinated act of war launched by French and Dutch enemies. Instead of working together to fight the shared threat, angry mobs turned on innocent immigrants in the chaotic streets. Meanwhile, over 100,000 refugees dumped their entire lives into carts or carried them on their backs, fleeing toward the open fields of Moorfields outside the stone walls. They sat in the dirt and watched their community vanish into a giant column of black smoke that was visible 60 miles away. I want you to look closely at this biological and structural collapse. This phase of the disaster teaches us that the secondary effects of a crisis, like the breakdown of trust, communication, and basic supplies, are often just as destructive as the primary threat. London was already weak because it was still recovering from the Great Plague just 1 year earlier, which had killed 15% of its population. The city had failed to use that previous biological shock to reset its safety rules and spacing. They kept the same dangerous, crowded habits, and the math finally caught up with them. When you operate a system with zero margin for error, a single bad day will trigger a total collapse that strips away your wealth, your security, and your peace of mind. By Tuesday, the disaster reached its absolute peak, showing us what happens when a small problem scales up into an unstoppable force. Think of a massive crisis like a snowball rolling down a mountain. If you do not stop it at the top, it gains so much momentum that even your strongest walls will crumble under the weight. The data brings our focus to the center of the city, where the original massive stone structure of Old St. Paul's Cathedral stood. For generations, the public viewed this giant church as an unshakable fortress. Local business owners and booksellers trusted its stone walls so much that they packed the crypts below with millions of dollars worth of rare literature and inventory, believing it was the safest vault in England. But they overlooked a fatal vulnerability in the surrounding area. The cathedral was going through major repairs and was completely encased in hundreds of thick wooden scaffolding poles. By Tuesday evening, the flying sparks carried by the heavy winds landed directly onto this dry wood. The scaffolding caught fire, acting like a giant wooden jacket burning around the building. The heat intensified at an alarming rate, spiking to a staggering 1,200 degrees Celsius. To put that into perspective, that is hot enough to melt solid iron. As the temperature rose, the physical science of the disaster took over. The cathedral's massive roof was covered in 6 acres of solid lead. Under the extreme thermal pressure, this metal began to liquefy. It turned into a glowing, boiling river that poured down the stone steps and into the streets like volcanic lava. The intense heat caused the air trapped inside the stone walls to expand so quickly that the giant pillars literally exploded outward like firecrackers. London's greatest architectural anchor was completely wiped out in a matter of hours. Take a hard look at this specific data point. The destruction of the cathedral teaches us that in a total system failure, no asset is safe if it is surrounded by unprotected hazards. You cannot protect your most valuable projects if you leave them wrapped in flammable risks. This terrible elemental reset forced the government to completely change its perspective on safety. It proved that the old ways of building were completely obsolete. When the fire finally began to die down, the leaders had to accept a harsh truth. They could not just patch up the old city. They had to use this painful blank slate to completely redesign their laws, wipe out the old blueprint, and rebuild a brand new foundation from scratch. Once a system completes its reset, It enters a phase of rapid growth. If you do not design your new system carefully, your progress will create a huge gap between the rich and the poor. The data shows us that after the Great Fire, London transformed into a global powerhouse. This massive economic explosion was fueled by a very interesting cultural shift: the rise of the coffee house. Think of these 17th-century coffee houses like the original internet. They were local spaces where merchants, sailors, and thinkers gathered to drink coffee and share data. For the price of a single penny, anyone could walk in, read the latest news, and debate ideas. These social spaces gave birth to the world's first major insurance markets, banks, and global trading companies, sparking an industrial revolution. But while the city's wealth exploded, its population grew faster than the infrastructure could handle. The numbers tell a brutal story of inequality. By 1801, the population hit 1 million people, and by 1901, it rocketed to over 6 million. Because the city grew so quickly, millions of poor laborers were crammed into dark, filthy slums. There were no clean water pipes or trash systems for these families. The streets became flowing rivers of raw waste, leading to a massive crisis known as the Great Stink. The pollution was so severe that the smell from the river actually shut down the government parliament buildings. The data shows us a clear, hard truth. When you focus entirely on making a profit but ignore the health of your community, the entire system becomes toxic. I want you to look at how the city finally solved this problem, because it gives us an important blueprint for managing growth. The government did not just try to clean the surface. They brought in a brilliant engineer named Joseph Bazalgette to completely redesign the city's underground infrastructure. He built a massive, sprawling network of brick sewer pipes that safely carried waste away from the population. This engineering triumph effectively wiped out deadly outbreaks of disease and saved millions of human lives. At the same time, famous writers like Charles Dickens used their stories to chronicle the dark underbelly of the city, forcing the wealthy public to look at the rampant street crime and brutal poverty around them. This chapter of history teaches us that true progress requires a balance. You cannot build a sustainable operation if your success creates extreme luxury for a few people while the rest of your team is trapped in a toxic environment. When you plan for the future, you must build strong infrastructure and treat your people with empathy. True growth is not just about increasing your numbers or expanding your wealth. It is about making sure that your foundation is healthy enough to support every single person inside the system. In the final chapter of this macro-narrative loop, we look at the ultimate test of any system: its resilience during a crisis that it did not cause. Think of a major historical challenge like a stress test on a bridge. It applies massive pressure to see if the structure will crack or if the foundation is truly unshakable. The data brings us into the mid-20th century, when London faced its next massive crucible. During World War II, a terrifying military aerial onslaught known as the Blitz rained explosives down on the capital for 57 consecutive nights. Entire neighborhoods were completely leveled, and thousands of historic brick structures were turned to piles of smoking rubble. But just like the Great Fire centuries earlier, this terrible destruction forced a massive wave of regeneration. The post-war data shows us that the city did not just try to copy its old layout. Instead, it used the cleared space to build entirely new housing, modern schools, and open public parks. At the same time, London faced a major labor shortage and an aging population. To fix this system vulnerability, the government made a massive structural pivot. In 1948, a ship called the Empire Windrush arrived, bringing the first wave of thousands of Caribbean immigrants to the UK. Over the next few decades, global waves of people from South Asia, Africa, and all across the Earth followed, completely changing the demographics of the capital. These new communities brought fresh ideas, massive cultural energy, and a powerful work ethic that rebuilt the city from the inside out. They filled vital jobs in transportation, healthcare, and manufacturing, proving that diversity is not just a nice idea, it is a critical resource that keeps an empire running. Today, the modern skyline reflects this incredible resilience. If you look up, you will see historical landmarks sitting right next to giant, hypermodern towers made of glass and steel, like Canary Wharf and the O2 Arena. The city has transformed into a hyper-dynamic financial capital where over 300 different languages are spoken every single day. As your mentor, I want you to remember the ultimate lesson of this entire 2,000-year journey. London survived Roman withdrawal, Viking raids, the Black Death, the Great Fire, and the Blitz. Each time the system was brought to its knees, it did not stay down. It adapted, it brought in new people, and it rebuilt itself stronger than before. A crisis will always expose the weak points in your current plan, but it also gives you a rare blank slate to create something grander. When you face a major setback in your own life or work, do not just try to patch up the damage. Look at the data, break down your old limits, and use that moment to build a better foundation. If you want to discover more incredible turning points where a single human error completely changed the world, hit the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments below which historic disaster we should map out next. I will see you in the past.